The John A. Logan College Teaching and Learning Center presents the Logan Defenders Podcast, featuring the college's cybersecurity team, coached by Mark Rogers.
Hello, I'm Trenton Taylor, and I'm here to talk about wireless security. Now, first I'd like to talk about wireless as in Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi is the common term for the 802.11 standard, which is just a techno thing for Wi-Fi, essentially. And that is a standard that was implemented, I believe, around 1999 or so. And it broadcast on the around the 2.5 megahertz and 5.8 megahertz now, more recently, on the radio band, which is part of the industrial, scientific, and medical band. And that is essentially just open wireless spectrum that anyone can use, as opposed to like your phone, which uses Verizon's bands, which they own in the United States or wherever. But throughout the world, almost every country has these bands dedicated to open usage. And as far as security goes, though, unfortunately, wireless is inherently less secure than wired connections. There is, no matter what security standards you put in place, it is just always going to be less secure because of the nature of it. And there are things you can do to mitigate that, and one of those is encryption. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to talk about how wireless routers work and where you should kind of place them. Now, the way wireless works, at least in the context of an antenna-based router with the longer antennas that stick up, is they're omnidirectional usually. There are others, but the ones you'll usually get for home usage will be like that, and this is good. But there are things you should know, and that is, even though they're omnidirectional, the way they work, they expand, and the radio waves go out, is in a kind of a donut torus shape. If you know what a torus is, it's essentially a donut. And that means around it is really good. In theory, mostly under it will be fine eventually, but directly under and directly above it can be a little bit wonky. And in practice, that may not necessarily be the case, but if you're having issues, that might be something to look into. You should ideally place it at the same height devices that will be connecting to it will be at. So probably around chest height or so. And if you can place it in a central location, that is very much ideal. And you should place it away from anything that will block radio waves, which commonly is metal and water. So fish tanks, not good. Don't place it near air ducts and all that. And that might be why you're having issues if you are having issues. As far as security goes, though, it's primarily accomplished through encryption. And there's other stuff for more enterprise usage. But for consumer use, you'll mostly run using encryption. The first standard, and I mean that in the literal sense that it was the first standard for security since the implementing of Wi-Fi, is WPA, and you should not use this. It is very bad. It is extremely easy to crack. I think I managed to crack it in like 15 minutes, and I wouldn't say that's very good. My friend managed to crack the school's Wi-Fi in like 8 and place the encryption key on my school administrator's desk. If you really need to use it, and you might if you play a lot of video games like Nintendo DS, you should try and figure out a solution to offer 2 separate networks. But really, if you can not use it, you shouldn't. WPA was an interim standard because WEP was not great, so they started developing a new one. And this uses TKIP, which I'm not going to get into terribly much, but it is more secure than WEP by a significant margin. It is not, there's no known attacks, but it is considered depreciated. And if WPA2 is available, you should be using that instead. And WPA2 is the current one, and it uses AES, and that's the same stuff. If you've ever used a browser securely, you'll notice there's sometimes an icon up there that's green, and that uses, in addition to some other techniques involving public key encryption and stuff that really you don't need to worry about, but it also uses this same AES encryption standard. And AES currently has no known security flaws. And any attacks are going to be brute force attacks, which is a fancy way of saying you try A, then B, then C, then D, and so on. Which means it's essentially as strong as the passkey you use is. If you need to change your wireless standard because you're still using WEP or something, you should definitely check your security settings to make sure you are using WPA2. You will need to access your router with its web interface, and to do this, you're going to need to go to its IP address in a browser. And the browser is Internet Explorer or Firefox or something like that. And to find out your IP address, you should probably look at your documentation. If you know it, great. There are various command line things you can do to find it. Or look on the web, and you probably will be able to find something to find it out. But look for your documentation on your router, which it came with. Look up the model number, whatever. Usually, it is going to be 192.168.0.1 or 192.168.1.1. It may vary, but try one of those, and you should come up with a page that looks all fancy. And there's here a guide on TechSpot, which will give you the various IP addresses if they aren't one of those. And once there, you will probably need to log in, and this you're definitely going to just need to look for manufacturer information. Sometimes it's admin, as an admin for the username and admin for the password. Sometimes it's admin and password for the password, but it varies widely, and it is a good idea to just Google your router model number or manufacturer, and usually you'll be able to find the list of usernames that the manufacturer has used. And once you've found that and logged in, you're going to need to find your security settings. And again, it's going to vary by manufacturer. Documentation, if you can find it. Most have it under settings similar to wireless, and depending on the router, an additional tab might be there that says wireless security or security. And once you find this, you should check what you're using. If you're using WEP or WPA, you should change it to WPA2. If that's not available, use WPA. And if all that's available is WEP, you should seriously consider upgrading your router. And in addition to that, it might offer an option called encryption. And if it does, I would choose AES only. And this is kind of really detail oriented, but essentially it might offer an option called AES plus TKIP as well. And that's just for compatibility. Now, if you can use AES only without having issues, go ahead and do that, because TKIP is considered depreciated. But most devices that have come out within the last 5 years will support AES. But don't worry too much if you want to just leave it. And it may not be available as a setting. When you're choosing a password to use with WPA, there's a lot of characteristics you should think about. Chris has a video on passwords or will, and he's going to probably offer some great advice on passwords. The ideal password for wireless would, to me, be random, contain no real world words, and use sufficient complexity, which will vary based on how you construct your password. I would note that it should be typable on mobile devices, because passwords I use for general use will contain a lot of characters that are way too complex to type on a iPhone or like device. And if you start getting into like the Wii or printer UI for like a wireless printer, it might become even worse to have to type these. And you really want your password to be typable, but for just practical reasons. And that's fine. You can do that and still make it secure. But to make a password, I would use a password generator. Don't rely on thinking something up, because that just is going to produce a less secure password. There's a great password generator at norton.com if you have not watched Chris's video to install a password manager, which will have a password generator likely. If not, go ahead and use whatever is recommended in terms of password generators and all that. If you're going to follow my thought on this and generate lowercase a through z and 0 through 9 password as an alphanumeric, do at least 11 characters. I would do 15, 16, 20 if you can. It's still going to be easier to type in than a password loaded with symbols. If you're going to use Norton's thing, then deselect everything except include letters and include numbers, and then put in the length you're willing to type in. I think mine at home is 16. If you want what I use, and then select generate passwords. And that should be secure enough for most usage. While we're in the routers menu, if you're doing that, it is not a bad idea to change your router's login info, because let's say you invite a family member over, and your family member is of the computer security hackery type. Now, it wouldn't be that hard for them to look up your router's info and then go and change settings for fun or malicious reasons, but essentially it just prevents anyone else from changing stuff but you. And you're going to have to check with your manufacturer for detailed settings on how to do this, but you can probably find it under admin or administration, and then just change the username and password to whatever you want. And for this, however, I would follow whatever Chris says about passwords. You don't need to make any really special changes, because anytime you ever mess with this, you will probably be on a desktop computer. When it comes to public networks, in terms of Wi-Fi, you should just be careful. I'd say that you should never use them, but I can't follow that security advice. So I don't know if I could ask anyone else to. Really, you should avoid them if you can. There is no assumptions that you can make about their security. Unfortunately, they could be done in a relatively secure manner. They could be done in a manner that leaves you completely open to attack. When you're doing them, when you connect, you should definitely tell it you are on a public network, so it chooses the appropriate security settings on your side. And be paranoid. Don't go to like banking sites, avoid shopping or anything that transfers credit card information. And if you do need to do that, definitely look for a little green icon or whatever is available, whatever there is on your browser to indicate that you are on a secure connection, and it should have a little lock or whatever. But know that even if you're doing this, you can still be compromised. If you've heard of Heartbleed, this is one of the reasons it was a big deal, is because, without getting too technical, essentially Heartbleed gave out information from servers that made it so people could look back at any encrypted communications that were between like your computer and their servers and know what was in them, even if they were encrypted, like with the lock I just mentioned. And that was why it was so scary, because unless the people took issues, so even if that happened, it'd be secure, it would be compromised. So you should be aware that even if you do everything right in terms of looking for little green locks and all that, you still should avoid using public networks, because that is still something that can be compromised and listened into just in case that data is useful later. And another thing, I would avoid setting auto connect up. If you can go and find this option, I'm not sure how it is on Mac and all that, but if you right click your thing, you should be able to find a menu that will let you prevent you from auto connecting to that network, and you should definitely do that. Look up how to do that, because the way it works would potentially allow an attacker to set up a network with the same information, and you would end up automatically connecting to the attacker's network, and they'd have free reign in terms of you being on their network, so they can do whatever they want to you. And all they have to do is say, oh, hi, I'm a McDonald's Wi-Fi router, or I'm a Starbucks router, or I'm John A. Logan's router. I'd like to also talk about phone security briefly. Phones mainly use Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and NFC. Not all use NFC. Bluetooth is a standard for exchanging data over short distances, around 30 meters, I think is the top. And they're on the same band as Wi-Fi in terms of ISM, so they work around the world. And simply put, I turn it off when you're not using it. There's a lot of reasons. There's potential security issues. Not necessarily to the point where you should never ever use Bluetooth devices, but there's no reason to have it on if you don't need it. If not because of security, then because it will retrain your battery. And if you're on Android, you can do this by 2-finger swiping from the top and then tapping the Bluetooth icon. And if you are in a version before 4.2, you can try single-finger swiping from the top and then clicking the gear icon. Or finding menus. You can look it up if you are way before that and that does not work. On iOS 7.0 or later, which if you have the flat icons, you will have 7.0. It should look similar to that. Swipe up from the bottom of the screen, and you will get a menu with a variety of options, including a flashlight, which is extremely convenient, if you didn't know that existed, and a little icon to turn Bluetooth and Wi-Fi off. And you can turn Wi-Fi off here as well, which is not a bad idea if you're not using Wi-Fi. But yeah, go ahead and turn Bluetooth off if you're not using it, and turn it back on when you are. And then there's NFC, which is a more recent technology, and you're seeing this be used in all phones. NFC essentially uses electric fields or magnetic fields, and it communicates over really short distances, and we're talking inches, not like feet or meters. And the current buzzword use is things like mobile payments with phones and stuff, and there's software like Google Wallet, Apple Pay, and then ISIS, which is now SoftCard. And then there's been other uses, including contact sharing. I know video games have used it for little figurines, and it's just being used for a lot of different stuff now. My phone allows me to require authentication before making any payments with it, and if you have a setting like that on your phone, you should definitely turn them on. And if you don't use NFC and you don't ever use it to like make payments at McDonald's or whatever, or for anything else, just turn it off. There's no reason to have it on, and you're going to have to look through manufacturers' websites and just search how to turn NFC off on iPhone or whatever, or Android, if you don't use it. Now, because of its nature of short use, its security is about as big of an issue as like pickpockets and all that, which is to say, I'd leave it on personally if you use it. If you don't use it all the time, I'd turn it off when you're not, but I realize that going through a ton of menus, people won't always do that, which I'll get back to later. Finally, I'd like to mention calls and texting. These are probably the most secure in terms of just pedestrian security. However, if you are worried about things like the NSA or criminals with advanced capabilities or police surveillance states and all that, you should consider using encryption for calls and text. And you can do this by using software such as Redphone, and I've used that, and it was pretty easy to use. I've used similar texting apps. They're not terribly hard to use. I believe I've used something called Schmoose for encrypted texting, and that works on a variety of platforms, which I needed because I was talking to someone on Windows Phone, and I wanted to encrypt that. And so you can check out some of these apps. I'm sure there will be people on the internet who will offer way better guidance than I can, but I've used Redphone and Schmoose, and they are both nice and fairly easy to use. The downside is both parties have to use it. So either you have to communicate in person that you want to use encryption just for security or whatnot. But this is more of an issue if you're worried about government surveillance or you're paranoid about some other entity who is capable of listening to this kind of information, which might be fair to be. And that brings me back to this. Security, you shouldn't let paranoia ruin your brand new phone. Security is about mitigating risk, and at the end of the day, you shouldn't assign any more importance than is necessary to it. And I don't mean to say security isn't important, but I know a lot of people get really paranoid about security or just flat out give up. Like, treat it like you would your car. There's some really easy things you can do that drastically increase the security of your car, like locking the doors when you go into the store or rolling up the windows and not leaving them down. And these drastically increase your security and prevent you from being robbed with very little investment. And there's other things you can do, like put in a security system and cameras, and these might increase your security, but they also require a lot more investment on your part. And that's what you should think about in terms of security. Is the risk worth the investment? And that's just what I want to say, and thank you for listening.